Not everyone who pulls away is leaving you. Some are actually studying you. And the painful truth is, the more you try to chase them, the more invisible you become in their world. Because for certain personalities, love is never accepted at face value. It must survive silence, distance, and emotional uncertainty first. If this resonates with your experience, stay with this, because what comes next will explain why emotional distance is sometimes the strongest form of hidden attachment. Avoidant behavior is often misunderstood as emotional disinterest, but in reality, it is rooted in a deep internal conflict between desire for closeness and fear of emotional engulfment. When such a person develops feelings, something subtle shifts in their inner world. The connection feels real to them, but at the same time, it activates an old protective mechanism that associates intimacy with loss of control, dependency, or emotional overwhelm. So instead of moving forward directly, they begin to regulate the distance themselves. This regulation does not always look like rejection. It often appears as withdrawal, delayed responses, sudden emotional cooling, or a shift in availability. But beneath this surface behavior, the emotional bond is still active. They are not disconnecting from you entirely. They are trying to reduce the intensity of what they feel so they can observe it without feeling consumed by it. At the same time, they rely heavily on behavioral evidence rather than verbal reassurance. Words like, "I care," or "I'm here," are not as convincing to them as how you respond under uncertainty. They unconsciously watch whether you become anxious, whether you over-pursue, or whether you remain emotionally steady when the connection is not immediately reinforced. This is where the testing begins, not as a conscious manipulation, but as an internal survival strategy. Their emotional system is trying to answer one question without directly asking it. Is this connection safe enough for me to stay close without losing myself in it? And will your presence remain stable even when I temporarily step back from it? When emotional closeness begins to feel real for an avoidant person, they rarely move toward intimacy in a straightforward way. Instead, their expression becomes indirect, almost experimental. The tests they create are not planned strategies, but instinctive behaviors shaped by past experiences where closeness may have felt overwhelming, inconsistent, or emotionally unsafe. So rather than asking for reassurance directly, they construct situations where your reactions become the evidence they rely on. These tests often appear as emotional distance, delayed communication, or sudden shifts in availability. Sometimes they become less expressive right after a moment of closeness. Other times they may act slightly indifferent even when they clearly care. The purpose is not to confuse you for the sake of it, but to observe how you respond when emotional certainty is temporarily removed. What they are actually measuring is stability. Do you panic when the emotional temperature drops? Do you chase them more intensely when they pull back? Or do you maintain your emotional balance without collapsing into anxiety or over-explanation? In their internal logic, your behavior under uncertainty reveals more truth than your words during comfort. This is why consistency in your response becomes crucial in their perception. If you react with emotional overdependence, it confirms their fear that closeness leads to pressure. But if you remain grounded, not withdrawing, but also not chasing, it creates a new reference point for them, an experience of connection that does not feel suffocating. Over time, these repeated observations help them slowly recalibrate their emotional trust. What begins as distance is actually an attempt to measure whether closeness can exist without loss of self, and whether your presence remains steady even when their engagement temporarily disappears. These tests are fundamentally about emotional calibration rather than manipulation in a deliberate sense. When an avoidant person becomes emotionally invested, They often experience closeness as something intense and internally destabilizing. Because of that, they unconsciously look for signals that help them determine whether the connection can remain safe without becoming overwhelming. Patience becomes the first quality they observe, because impatience in the face of distance signals emotional urgency rather than emotional stability. If someone reacts quickly with panic, repeated messages, or visible distress, it confirms their internal expectation that closeness may come with pressure. Stability is the second and most important layer. They are not just watching whether you stay, but how you stay. Do you remain emotionally consistent even when their behavior fluctuates? Do you maintain your identity, your routines, and your sense of self? Or do you start orbiting entirely around their availability? To them, stability is proof that connection does not automatically lead to emotional chaos. Emotional control is the third element, and it is often the most revealing. This does not mean suppression of feelings, but regulation of expression. They observe whether your emotions are integrated or reactive. If you can feel disappointment without escalating into conflict, or feel uncertainty without losing composure, it signals maturity in their internal framework. That kind of response reduces their fear of emotional entanglement. Together, these three qualities form a silent assessment system. They are not consciously grading you, but their nervous system is registering patterns. Each reaction you give becomes data about whether closeness with you feels expansive or consuming. Over time, this determines whether they lean in closer or retreat further, not based on words, but based on the emotional environment you consistently create around them. For an avoidant person, distance is rarely what it looks like on the surface. It is not always rejection, and it is not always a decision to leave. More often, it is a form of emotional observation. When they pull back, they are creating space not just from you, but from the intensity of their own internal reactions. Closeness can activate vulnerability in them, and vulnerability feels unpredictable, so distance becomes a way to regain internal balance. In that space, they are watching you more than they are withdrawing from you. Your reaction becomes the focal point of their attention. Do you immediately fill the silence with messages? Do you attempt to restore connection at any cost? Or do you allow the space to exist without losing your emotional center? To them, this difference is not minor. It is the entire evaluation. Distance gives them clarity that closeness often clouds. When emotions are activated, they can feel overwhelmed by their own attachment. But when they step back, they regain the ability to think, process, and assess without emotional pressure. In that calmer state, they start reviewing patterns, how you behave when they are unavailable, whether your connection to them is rooted in presence or dependency, and whether your emotional world collapses in their absence. What they are truly looking for is not perfection, but consistency under absence. If your presence becomes frantic when they withdraw, it reinforces their fear that closeness creates instability. But if your presence remains steady, it creates a different emotional imprint, one where connection does not equal pressure. So their distance is not just absence. It is a quiet method of studying whether the bond remains intact even when they are not actively holding it, and whether your emotional state is self-sustaining rather than reaction-driven. Inconsistency in avoidant behavior is often misread as confusion or mixed intentions, but internally it is more controlled than it appears. It is not a lack of awareness about their feelings. It is a regulated way of managing emotional intensity. When closeness becomes too strong, they instinctively step back. When distance becomes too long, they may re-engage. This creates a rhythm that can feel unpredictable from the outside, but from their perspective, It is a balancing mechanism between attachment and self-protection. Instead of expressing emotional overwhelm directly, they regulate exposure. Too much connection at once can feel like loss of autonomy, so they reduce contact. But complete disconnection creates emotional discomfort in the opposite direction, so they reappear in subtle ways. This push and pull is not random. It is how they maintain a level of emotional engagement that feels tolerable to their nervous system. To an observer, this looks like mixed signals. To them, it feels like calibration. They are constantly adjusting the distance to find a point where connection exists without emotional flooding. In this process, they also observe how you respond to each shift. Whether you demand consistency immediately, whether you become anxious during withdrawal, or whether you maintain emotional steadiness across both phases. What makes this pattern powerful is that it is self-reinforcing. If you react strongly to inconsistency, they may increase distance to restore internal calm. If you remain steady, they begin to experience the connection as less threatening, which can slowly reduce the need for withdrawal. So what appears as inconsistency is actually a controlled emotional environment where they are trying to keep connection alive without triggering the internal fear that closeness will cost them their sense of self. For an avoidant mind, language is rarely the final proof of anything. Words are easy to produce, easy to repeat, and often disconnected from emotional reality. Because of this, verbal reassurance alone does not create safety for them. They have learned, through experience or conditioning, that people can promise closeness while behaving inconsistently later. So their attention shifts away from what is said and moves toward what is demonstrated over time. Behavior becomes the only reliable language they trust. Not grand declarations, but patterns. Do you remain consistent when things are uncertain? Do you show up without needing constant validation? Do you respect emotional space without withdrawing your care entirely? These repeated actions form a quiet structure in their mind, something more reliable than emotional intensity in a single moment. Silence plays an even deeper role in their perception. Where most people feel silence as absence, they often experience it as information. Silence reveals whether connection is emotionally stable or dependency-driven. If silence causes panic, overreaction, or emotional escalation, it signals instability in their internal framework. But if silence is met with calm presence, it creates a different imprint entirely, one where connection does not collapse in the absence of communication. Promises, on the other hand, are treated with caution, not because they are ignored, but because they are considered incomplete without behavioral evidence. A promise is only meaningful to them when it is repeatedly validated through action under different emotional conditions. Over time, they begin to form trust, not through emotional intensity, but through behavioral reliability. What remains consistent in action, even when words are absent, becomes the foundation of their emotional safety, and silence becomes less of a threat and more of a space where truth is quietly revealed. If you chase an avoidant person when they pull away, you unintentionally reinforce the very fear that created their distance in the first place. To them, intense pursuit during emotional withdrawal feels like proof that closeness comes with pressure, urgency, and loss of personal space. It confirms their internal expectation that connection may eventually become overwhelming or consuming. When you react by chasing, through repeated messages, emotional explanations, or attempts to fix the distance, you shift the dynamic from connection into emotional demand. In their perception, this reduces their sense of autonomy. Instead of feeling drawn closer, they feel the need to create more space to regain internal balance. So the withdrawal deepens, not because they care less, but because the emotional intensity has increased beyond their comfort threshold. However, when you remain grounded, something different happens in their internal processing. Not disengaged, not cold, but steady. You continue living your life, maintaining your emotional center, and not collapsing into urgency. This creates a contrast they cannot ignore. It introduces a new reference point: closeness without pressure, presence without emotional chasing, attachment without loss of self. This does not instantly pull them closer, but it forces a reassessment. Their nervous system begins to register that connection with you does not automatically lead to emotional overwhelm. Instead of associating you with pressure, they start associating you with stability under uncertainty. Over time, this shift is what changes their behavior. Not persuasion, not argument, not emotional pursuit, but the lived experience of your consistency. In their internal logic, what does not trigger overwhelm becomes safer, and what becomes safer becomes more accessible. Your grounded presence becomes the contrast that slowly weakens their instinct to withdraw.